All right, today we're going to get right into our interview. I'm going to interview a friend of mine, a man who I'm sure you're familiar with his name at this point. He is a warrior against critical race theory. He's fearless, talking to even the most staunch adherents to critical race theory. I'm talking about senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, Chris Rufo. Chris, good to see you. Thanks for being here.
It's great to be with you.
Okay, so you're really great when you talk to leftists about this. You, I think, of anybody, are perhaps the one person solely responsible for starting. You're the vanguard for the war against critical race theory in our nation right now. So I want to talk a little bit about critical race theory itself, but also about this strategy that you have employed that's helped expose the left's, well, their tactics and their strategy on critical race theory. So I want to get very basic here at the beginning, because the left right now is trying to deny that the definition of critical race theory is actually critical race theory. They claim that it's simply anti-racism. They want to teach about slavery. They want to teach about the history, the stain of slavery in American history. It's not critical race theory. They say that's exclusive to law schools. So could you define for us critical race theory?
Yeah, absolutely. There's kind of the myth, right? It's critical race theory is a lens for looking at the history of racism in the United States. We know that that's false simply by definition. We know that you can do all of those things without critical race theory. It doesn't make critical race theory unique in any way. But here's a simple definition, and I think actually most critical race theory scholars would agree with it. Critical race theory is an academic discipline that maintains that the United States was founded on white supremacy, capitalist exploitation, and racial oppression, and that those forces are still at the root of our society today. And critical race theory argues that American institutions such as the Constitution, the legal system, social customs, everything down to individual psychology, preaches these great values like freedom and equality, but in fact are mere smokescreens or mere camouflage for racial domination, which they believe infects and manifests in every aspect of our society and is the driving force behind all human behavior.
Right, and that's a pretty significant, first of all, that's comprehensive definition, but that's a pretty significant definition or worldview. So when we're talking about critical race theory in schools, oftentimes Democrats will say it's not critical race theory. And I want to use a very specific example here. There's a book that's being used in an Evanston school district in Illinois that teaches about whiteness, and it has a white person dressed up as a devil and says that it's not my fault, and then has the student, this is taught to kindergartners, I believe, disavow their whiteness. Do you believe that that is critical race theory in practice, that type of book, that type of ideology that's being taught to little children?
Yeah, I mean, it's not just that I believe it, it's just a fact. It conforms with the evidence, it conforms with the existing materials on critical race theory. And that specific example is a book called Not My Idea. It's taught not only in the kind of Evanston area of Illinois, it's also taught in Pennsylvania. I've heard reports that it's being taught in the state of Washington. It's probably actually many more places that we just don't know about. But this idea, it presents an image of the devil holding up a contract, luring children into whiteness with the promise of, quote, stolen land and stolen riches. All of this derives from one of critical race theory's core tenets, the idea of whiteness as property. That whiteness is a system not only of race, but also of social domination that provides white people with stolen labor, stolen land, stolen riches, and special privileges. It's not only, we know it's critical race theory, it's actually a very textbook example of one of critical race theory's core tenets. Someone who says that they have nothing to do with each other is either being dishonest or more likely probably hasn't done the homework, probably doesn't know what critical race theory really argues, and simply wouldn't be able to connect the two together.
So that actually is a perfect bridge to my next question, because I feel like there's a conversation that is perhaps as a hindrance to eradicating critical race theory from our school districts and really from our country as a whole. And that is this distinction of whether something is critical race theory or whether it's not critical race theory, when regardless of whether it is critical race theory or not, it is racist, right? And this book is a perfect example of that. So do you believe that it is critical, and sorry for the pun, it is intended, do you believe that it's critical to label these things as critical race theory, or does that serve as just a distraction from the overall debate that this stuff is racist regardless of what you want to call it and we should get it out of our schools?
No, I think it's absolutely essential to be thinking of it in terms of critical race theory, because if you look at any of these examples of different abusive practices in the curricula, ideas of race essentialism, ideas of collective guilt, ideas of actually segregating students and teachers in public environments, All of those things you could maybe fight one-on-one, like a whack-a-mole game where you follow each example from each city, from each story. But if you don't understand the framework, you don't understand the underlying ideology, you're not going to be able to effectively fight against it. So what I've tried to do is educate the American people about what critical race theory is, what are its core tenets, and how does it manifest itself in American institutions, particularly in K through 12 education. So it's important to have that theoretical knowledge, because then you can go and attack it at its theoretical foundations rather than trying to go kind of one at a time and spinning your head around trying to keep up. But I think your other point is also true, that the left has tried to lay out a kind of linguistic quicksand by denying, by obfuscating, by confusing, by deliberately misleading, trying to play language games. And it's important that we stay strong, that we stay focused, and we stay really kind of laser charged on this. All of these ideas, for example, race essentialism, for example, collective guilt, for example, state-sanctioned racial discrimination, those are critical race theory. We're going to pound that into the sand so that everybody knows it. And the polling numbers are actually extraordinary. In the last 6 months, really, a year to 6 months, according to a recent Economist poll, we've educated approximately 135 million Americans on critical race theory. They know to a certain extent what it means. I think that's important. I think we need to keep it up.
I think you're exactly right on this, actually, because it's very easy for the left, if these incidents or these examples of critical race theory in schools, if it's not under that larger umbrella of the critical race theory ideology, it's very easy to be dismissive of each as just an isolated incident that is not indicative of a larger poisonous ideology infiltrating our nation. So I think you're exactly right on that. Teachers' unions, Chris. So we know that this month we have seen, especially from the NEA, we've seen admissions in their resolutions, the measures that they passed at their annual conference, that they want to fund opposition research against, well, you, to be honest, opposition research against you. They want to prioritize critical race theory. You and I know from the history of critical race theory that it is the child of critical legal studies, which is the child of critical theory, which was coined, or it was created, invented at the Frankfurt School by Max Horkheimer back in the 1930s. It is Marxism, just using as a vanguard for a Marxist revolution, racial divide rather than a worker elitist divide here. So my question about the teachers' unions is, are they aware that what they are perpetuating is Marxism? Are they Marxists?
Yeah, I mean, some might be, some might not be. I think most teachers, in my experience and in reporting on this, they simply want to do the right thing. They want to address important racial issues. They're given these curricula, and they haven't done the homework to understand really what's underlying these ideas. I think a lot of the individual teachers are really used as pawns in this political game. But certainly what we've seen from the NEA, also now from the AFT, the two largest teachers unions, representing teachers in virtually every public school in this country, they've now endorsed critical race theory officially at their annual meeting. The NEA has. They want to promote it in all 50 states. They want to promote it in all 14,000 local school districts across the country. And here's the thing, they own this issue now. They can't hide, they can't play word games, they can't, play peekaboo. We know what they believe. They're committed to critical race theory. They're committed to opposition to capitalism. They're committed even absurdly to opposition to anthropocentrism, the idea that we should think about human beings first and foremost. They have descended into the utter madness of the far left's worst ideas from academia. Now they're trying to mainstream them in K through 12 education. But this, people say, hey, Chris, they're funding now opposition research against you personally, against your allies. It doesn't scare me or bother me one bit. In fact, just the opposite. They have now staked a claim. They've publicly owned this issue. And it's time for us to pummel them mercilessly and relentlessly, because there's nothing more important than what happens to our kids. And I'll fight all 3 million union members of the NEA any day of the week.
Right. It's a compliment to you, really, that you're so effective that they're personally wanting to fund opposition research against you. You have so many allies, parents across the nation, in addition to conservatives, including myself. I mean, you're doing great work. There is a wing of conservatism, though, and I'm not going to subtweet this and just say some conservatives. I'm gonna say the name. David French thinks that it's a violation of the First Amendment to ban teaching critical race theory in public schools across the nation. You disagree with this. Can you tell us why?
Yeah, I mean, David French should know better. He's a Harvard-educated lawyer. He's called critical race theory about a decade ago racial poison that leads to sheer malice. He knows exactly what critical race theory is. He knows exactly the damage that it has done to institutions. And yet, because of his kind of transformation, let's call it that, charitably in the last few years, he is reflexively opposed to any accomplishment or any initiative by conservatives, by the American right. And it's not a kind of principled stance. It's, I think, a much more personal stance for him. And he has forgotten the lesson from law school many years ago that the First Amendment doesn't exist to protect public institutions from voters, from the people. The First Amendment exists to protect the people from the government. So, of course, these are public schools. The public education system is a state-run monopoly. And even under the most stringent and dogmatic libertarian philosophy, under monopoly conditions, some government intervention is not only prudent, but it's actually necessary. And here's the bottom line. Voters who pay for and pass the legislation to fund public schools get to decide what happens within those public institutions. David French is absolutely wrong. It's atrocious legal reasoning. But more importantly, it just shows that he has an allergy to winning. He's kind of just kind of temperamentally unable to even conceive of the idea of victory. And with any kind of enabler, you learn this in if you ever attend or talk to anyone who's attended an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, the solution to enablers is to cut them out of the process. Political leaders should ignore the prevarications and the nitpicking of people like David French, and they should side with millions of American parents who are concerned about their kids getting abused and indoctrinated in the classroom. These are common sense measures supported by a large majority of the public, and that's where I stand.
Right, and I think too there's a big difference, and this is where I haven't heard David French differentiate between the two with discussing an idea, right? And this is also where the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in front of Congress made the mistake of, sure, we read, we even read brutal dictators books. We read the book of Mao Zedong, we read Lenin, we read Marx, all those things to study, to know your enemies. There's a difference between studying something in order to understand what motivates the opposition, to understand the poisonous ideology of the opposition, versus teaching something as if it's objective truth. And that's what critical race theory is. We're not teaching kindergartners to think critically about critical race theory so that we can understand our opponent's mindset. They're teaching critical race theory as if that is objective truth, as if white people are inherently racist, as if America was conceived in racism and to this day is systemically racist. That's a pretty big, significant, critical differentiation that those arguing that it's a violation of the First Amendment to ban teaching critical race theory in schools don't talk about. Speaking of that, though, one of the things that I've heard from a lot of parents across the country, and I'm sure you have too, is how do they detect critical race theory in their child's school curriculum if the words critical race theory don't appear? So I wanted to ask you for some actual examples, not hypothetical, some actual examples of this kind of ideology being taught, aside from the Evanston book example.
Yeah, I mean, you have to, first of all, be involved. You have to be actively participating in your kids' education. You have to go to the teacher and ask to look at materials. You have to go to the school district and ask to see the curriculum. And I think it's kind of like that old idea about pornography. You know it when you see it. Parents, their kind of alarm bells will ring when they see a curriculum in front of them that appears to traffic in racial stereotypes, in racial scapegoating, in kind of race-based harassment. It's not really hard to detect, but I think a couple key places to look. Anti-racism isn't necessarily the same thing as critical race theory, but if you see a phrase kind of like anti-racism or racial equity, or you see white privilege or white fragility, these are maybe not necessarily done in a malicious way, may not necessarily violate some of these laws that have passed in red states, but it should at least get your antenna up. It should at least get you looking. And listen, parents across this country are good people. They're sophisticated people. They know if they see it, they'll know it, and they'll just intuitively understand if something is wrong. And I think it's really important to make this point too. We absolutely, everyone in this country, I think with maybe virtually zero exceptions, thinks that we should take a really hard look at the history of racism, slavery, segregation, and injustice in our country in order to make our country better, in order to bring people of different racial backgrounds together in a united way to work, to improve the possibilities for everyone in this country. You can do that without critical race theory. And in fact, practicing critical race theory makes division much more likely. And Rasmussen recently put out polling data. They asked all different people of all different political backgrounds, people of all different racial backgrounds, do you think that practicing critical race theory in the classroom will improve race relations? Every single group, white, black, Asian, Latino, Democrat, Independent, Republican, they said no. It would actually make race relations worse. So the American people know exactly what time it is, and we should follow their lead.
Yeah, I would argue too that in order to make our nation better, in order to travel even further away from racial injustice, that we have to eliminate critical race theory, that we can't improve our nation if we're operating through a lens of critical race theory, because that's fundamentally unjust. So, question about the narrative coming from the left. So it seems like every week, and I talk about this on my show this week, every week the left has a new narrative or a new talking point about critical race theory, because as we just routinely debunk their narratives, they have to come up with something new. Their latest was that critical race theory isn't taught in K-12 schools, but the teachers union's annual conference debunked that. They also claim that it's not critical race theory, that opponents of critical race theory just don't want the history of racism taught in schools. Obviously untrue. What's your prediction on what the next iteration of their talking points is?
I mean, it gets to the point of absurdity. I mean, I expect them to say that critical race theory isn't critical race theory. I mean, we're really at the point where they're running out of options. I think what actually is likely to happen, and what we're already seeing kind of happen at the edges, is all of those kind of fake arguments that critical race theory is only in law schools, that critical race theory isn't in K through 12, that all of these ideas like white privilege, white fragility, internalized white supremacy aren't really critical race theory. Those have all really been demolished over time. I think what we're going to see is the left is going to be forced to really put out its true colors. They're going to actually embrace critical race theory. The teachers union has now done it. And I think we're going to see people now defending critical race theory, attempting to kind of play defense on its merits. And this is exactly where we want them. We've really set aside and brushed aside all of their superficial arguments, all of their misleading arguments. And now I think we're going to get into the heart of it. As the American people understand what's happening in their government agencies, in their public schools, even in their workplace and corporate offices, they're now seeing the really true nature of critical race theory. And we're going to have to debate it. And the early indications are that this is going to be a disaster for the people who support it. And I think the wind is at our back for those of us who oppose it.
Yeah, especially if the left ends up doubling down and does, as you said, stake claim to this. They then admit that there are opponents. Final question is a personal question. You have rocketed or skyrocketed to some prominence, name recognition-wise, in the past year because you've been, like I said at the beginning, the primary warrior, the vanguard of this fight. And I think a lot of people, both on conservative side and liberal side, wonder, how did you get into this? How did you decide that this was going to be your fight?
Yeah, I mean, life is full of surprises, and sometimes you end up on a path that you didn't anticipate. And this is one of those stories. I was reporting on crime, homelessness, street disorder in West Coast cities, and I actually got leaked an anonymous tip that said, hey, you need to check out what's happening in the city of Seattle. They're hosting internalized white supremacy and whiteness training programs, asking employees to denounce themselves for their racial identity. And abusing them really at every level of the city government. So I broke that story really as I thought a one-off. I thought it was an interesting thing that was happening. I thought actually it was limited to places as kind of out there as the city of Seattle. But something really surprising happened. After I broke that first story, I started getting first tens and then hundreds, and then now more than 5,000 sources from all different walks of life, from all different parts of the country, saying, hey, the same thing is happening in my institution, in my workplace, in my school, in my church, etc. And I realized that this was a hidden story that no one was talking about. And I had not only the unique access to all of these documents from all over the country, but I had really the obligation to really blow the whistle on what was happening. And I think that it was important because as we have gone through this kind of really wrenching racial conversation, we had obviously nationwide riots last year. We need to really understand the ideology that is guiding this conversation. And I thought I had a unique window into it. And I'll tell you, in closing, it's been fun. The last month I've spent defending myself against the attacks. The Washington Post, New York Times, CNN, MSNBC, New Republic, Atlantic, anyone that has any kind of footprint in the left-leaning media has gone on the attack against me. I've successfully fought them all off, and I'm excited to tell you and your audience that I am back on offense. I've actually received the internal quote unquote anti-racism documents for 26 of the Fortune 100 companies. Some really horrific practices in those documents. So we have successfully fought them off. They've done nothing but raise my profile, and now we're going to go back on offense, and we're going to be swinging big punches at these people, trying to get this toxic ideology out of our institutions.
And I like how this all brings a smile to your face as you recount these attacks against you and how you successfully fended them off. Chris, we're really proud of you. I know that our locals VIPs are, excited to hear from you, to hear your story, to hear your fight, and keep up the good work. We'll talk soon.
Thanks
for being here.
All right.